Welcome to Blissfully Boring. Let's get straight into it. The concept of a pharaoh's curse, an ancient retribution upon those who disturb the final resting place of Egyptian royalty, has captivated the public imagination for a century. This narrative is most famously tied to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, designated KV-62, in the Valley of the Kings by Howard Carter in 1922. The tomb had remained almost entirely intact for over 3,000 years, a rarity in a region heavily targeted by tomb robbers since antiquity. The excitement surrounding the discovery was immense, a global media event. However, this excitement soon mingled with a sense of foreboding. The idea of a curse was not new, but it found fertile ground in the aftermath of the tomb's opening. The first event to fuel the legend was the death of Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financial backer. He died in Cairo in April 1923, roughly 5 months after the tomb was unsealed. The cause of death was blood poisoning, resulting from an infected mosquito bite that he had nicked while shaving. Newspapers of the era, eager for sensational stories, quickly linked Carnarvon's demise to the desecration of the pharaoh's tomb. Reports claimed that an inscription found inside warned that death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. However, no such specific inscription has ever been officially documented by the excavation team. The phrase itself appears to be a journalistic invention, a dramatic embellishment that perfectly suited the growing myth. Following Carnarvon's death, the media began attributing other deaths to the so-called curse. These included individuals who were merely visitors to the tomb, or even relatives of the excavation team who had never been to Egypt. For instance, the death of George J. Gould I, a railroad financier who visited the tomb and died of pneumonia months later, was added to the list. Similarly, the passing of Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian prince shot by his wife in London, was also tenuously linked, simply because he had once visited the site. A closer examination of the historical record provides a more mundane explanation. Let's consider the core group of people who were present when the tomb was opened. Of the 26 individuals present at the initial opening, only 6 died within the subsequent decade. The average age at death for the 47 people most closely involved was 73, which was not unusually low for that era. Howard Carter himself, the man who led the excavation and was arguably the most significant disturber of the tomb, lived for another 17 years, passing away at the age of 64 in 1939. Many of the deaths attributed to the curse had clear, rational explanations. Several individuals were already of advanced age or in poor health. The environmental conditions inside a newly opened tomb also presented real, tangible risks. Sealed for millennia, these spaces could contain airborne pathogens like mold spores or bacteria. Aspergillus, a common fungus found in such environments, can cause respiratory infections, particularly in individuals with compromised immune systems. It is plausible that exposure to such elements could have contributed to illness, especially given the medical knowledge of the 1920s. The idea of tomb curses was not entirely without precedent in ancient Egypt, though not in the dramatic form popularized by the media. Some tombs from the Old Kingdom, predating Tutankhamun by more than 1,000 years, do contain protective inscriptions. These were typically aimed at tomb robbers or those who might desecrate the site. The warnings usually threatened divine retribution from gods like Anubis or Sekhmet, or earthly punishments from the king. They were meant to deter vandals and protect the deceased's eternal afterlife. However, these are quite different from the swift wings of death narrative. By the time of the New Kingdom, when Tutankhamun was buried, such explicit curse texts had become far less common. The enduring legend of the Pharaoh's curse is less a reflection of ancient Egyptian belief and more a testament to the power of modern storytelling. It emerged at a time of great interest in spiritualism and the occult, combined with the sensationalism of early 20th century journalism. The narrative provided a thrilling, supernatural explanation for a series of coincidental events, transforming a remarkable archaeological discovery into a cautionary tale. The truth, however, seems to lie not in ancient magic, but in a combination of natural causes, statistical probability, and a compelling story that was simply too good not to be told. The legacy of Tutankhamun is one of historical significance, not supernatural vengeance. Still, with logic pointing to coincidence, some may see more to it. Stories of curses have long been whispered, attached to the tombs of pharaohs and nobles. Beyond the well-known tales, a deeper and more nuanced history exists. These were not curses in the way we often imagine them today, but rather protective inscriptions designed to safeguard the final resting places of the dead. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife was a continuation of earthly existence, and a tomb was a crucial bridge between the two worlds. To ensure the deceased's journey was undisturbed, these warnings were carved into stone, serving as a deterrent for tomb robbers and vandals. They were a practical measure in a world where the desecration of graves was a genuine threat. One of the earliest known examples of such a protective formula comes from the Old Kingdom in the tomb of the mastaba of Kentika Ikaki, a vizier who lived during the 6th dynasty. His inscription does not call down supernatural wrath, but rather appeals to a sense of social and divine order. It warns that anyone who enters his tomb with impure intentions will be judged by the great God. The text reads, "As for any man who shall enter into this tomb of mine, being impure, I shall seize him by the neck like a bird. I shall cast the fear of myself into him." This threat is one of earthly consequence and divine judgment, a powerful combination in ancient Egyptian belief. It was less about a magical hex and more about a formal, legalistic warning, invoking the authority of the gods and the deceased's own spirit, or Ka. Another notable example is found in the tomb of Harkov, a governor of Elephantine from the same period. His inscription is more of a plea and a promise than a direct threat. It addresses future visitors, asking them to recite an offering prayer for him. In return for this kindness, Harkov promises to act as a spiritual advocate for them in the land of the dead. However, it also contains a warning for those who might cause damage. "As for any man who shall enter into this tomb and do evil against this tomb, I shall be judged with him by the great God." The consequence mentioned is not a sudden, dramatic affliction, but a final judgment in the afterlife, a concept central to Egyptian morality. The threat was a spiritual one, tied to the fate of one's soul. These inscriptions often followed a specific formula. They would typically identify the deceased, declare their good standing with the gods and the pharaoh, and then lay out the consequences for anyone who dared to disturb their eternal rest. The punishments described were varied. Some mentioned being attacked by crocodiles or hippopotamuses, creatures feared in daily life along the Nile. Others spoke of having no heir, of their earthly legacy being extinguished, or of their memory being erased. These were not random threats, but culturally specific fears. The continuation of one's family line and the preservation of one's name were profoundly important to the ancient Egyptians. To lose them was to suffer a kind of second death. The so-called curses were also aimed at a particular audience, the literate elite who could read the hieroglyphs. The average tomb robber, likely unable to read, would have been unaffected by the written words. For those who could understand them, the inscriptions were a solemn reminder of Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order, justice, and truth. To desecrate a tomb was to violate Ma'at, an act that would upset the balance of the universe, and invite retribution, not from a curse, but from the natural order of things. The guardians of the tomb were not just vengeful spirits, but the very structure of the cosmos itself. These protective texts offer a window into the ancient Egyptian worldview. They reveal a society deeply concerned with legacy, order, and the sanctity of the afterlife. The inscriptions were not intended to create legends of supernatural horror. Instead, they were a final, desperate attempt to protect what was most sacred, the eternal home of the soul. The stories we tell today are often a modern reinterpretation, colored by our own fascination with the mysterious and the macabre. The reality etched in stone was something more pragmatic and profound, a plea for respect, a warning of judgment, and a hope for eternity undisturbed. The true power of these ancient words lay not in magic, but in their appeal to the shared values of a civilization long past. The belief systems of ancient Egypt were complex, weaving together religion, magic, and science in ways that can be difficult for a modern observer to untangle. Among these beliefs was a strong conviction in the power of words and rituals, which extended into the realm of what we might today call curses. However, the Egyptian concept was more nuanced than the sensationalized curses often depicted in popular culture. For the ancient Egyptians, these were not simply malevolent whispers, but potent magical acts, grounded in the fundamental principles of their worldview. The Egyptian term for this concept was often related to Heka, the divine force of magic that permeated the universe. Heka was a neutral power, accessible to gods, the dead, and the living alike. It could be used for healing and protection, but it could also be directed to bring about harm. Curses, therefore, were a form of negative Heka, a deliberate use of magical power to inflict misfortune upon an enemy. This could range from causing illness or financial ruin to more severe outcomes. The power was believed to reside in the spoken word, the written text, and the symbolic act. One of the most well-known contexts for Egyptian curses is the tomb. Tomb inscriptions often included protective formulas intended to deter intruders and safeguard the deceased's eternal rest. These were not generic warnings, but specific threats, detailing the punishments that would befall anyone who dared to desecrate the sacred space. A typical inscription might threaten that a crocodile would be against the violator in the water, a snake against him on land, and that he would have no heir to succeed him. These formulas were a form of magical security system intended to function for eternity. They were meant to invoke the wrath of the gods, particularly deities associated with justice and the underworld, like Thoth or Osiris. Beyond the tombs, curses were also a part of daily life. People could commission magical texts or create figurines to influence events or harm rivals in love, business, or politics. So-called execration texts are a prime example. These were texts written on pottery vessels or figurines that named enemies of the state or individuals. The objects would then be ceremonially smashed, symbolically destroying the enemies and nullifying their power. This ritual practice was performed by priests on behalf of the pharaoh, demonstrating that the use of this form of magic was an institutionalized part of protecting the Egyptian state. Figurines, often made of wax or clay and shaped to resemble the intended target, were another common tool. Similar to the execration rituals, these effigies would be inscribed with the name of the person and then subjected to symbolic harm, being bound, pierced, or burned. This was believed to directly affect the individual they represented, a practice known as sympathetic magic. Manuals of magic, like the Greek and Demotic magical papyri from the later periods of Egyptian history, contain numerous spells and recipes for such purposes, providing detailed instructions on how to create and activate these curses against personal enemies. However, just as there was a strong belief in the power to curse, there was an equally strong belief in the power of protection. Amulets were ubiquitous in ancient Egyptian society, worn by the living and placed on the mummified remains of the dead. Each amulet had a specific purpose, intended to ward off different kinds of danger, from sickness and wild animals to malevolent spirits and magical attacks. The Eye of Horus, or Wedged Eye, was one of the most powerful protective symbols, representing healing and regeneration. The Ankh, a symbol of life, and the Djed pillar, representing stability, were also widely used. These objects were not mere decorations. They were believed to be imbued with magical properties, forming a constant, passive defense against the unseen dangers of the world. So, while the concept of the pharaoh's curse as a supernatural force that automatically strikes down any who disturb a tomb is largely a modern invention, its roots lie in a genuine ancient Egyptian belief. The Egyptians held a deep conviction in the power of magical speech and ritual to affect the world, for both protection and for harm. Their curses were not random superstition, but a logical extension of their understanding of the cosmos, a universe where words had tangible power and magic was a fundamental force, available to be wielded by those who knew how. This intricate system of belief demonstrates a world where the line between the sacred and the mundane was fluid, and where unseen forces were a constant and accepted part of reality. Thank you for watching. For centuries, whispers of curses have clung to the ancient tombs of Egypt, like the desert sand clinging to weathered stone. Beyond the famed story of Tutankhamun, many other narratives of misfortune and mystery surround the resting places of the pharaohs and their courts. These tales, often sensationalized, have their roots in the very real and elaborate measures the ancient Egyptians took to protect their dead. The inscriptions found within these tombs are not curses in the modern sense. They are solemn warnings, legalistic in nature, intended to deter grave robbers. An inscription in the 5th dynasty tomb of the physician Ankh-Mahor at Saqqara, for example, serves as a threat to anyone who would dare defile the sacred space. It warns that a violator will be judged in the afterlife, facing a tribunal with the great god. The text describes a grim fate for the trespasser, comparing their end to that of a goose being wrung by the neck. These were not supernatural hexes, but stern declarations meant to invoke fear of divine and earthly retribution. Another well-documented account involves the Giza pyramid complex. Early excavators and explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries often reported strange occurrences. While many of these can be attributed to the hazardous conditions of early archaeology, unstable structures, poor ventilation, and the presence of harmful bacteria and mold, the stories persisted. The tomb of Queen Khentkhas I, sometimes called the Fourth Pyramid of Giza, was one such site. Those who worked on its excavation reported a series of unfortunate events, though concrete evidence linking these events directly to a curse remains elusive. The concept of a tomb curse gained significant traction in Western culture, fueled by a fascination with the exotic and the unknown. The mastaba of Perneb, a higher-ranking official from the 5th dynasty, now resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Before its relocation in the early 20th century, local lore in Saqqara spoke of the tomb's protective power. It was believed that anyone disturbing Perneb's rest would suffer. Again, these stories are more a reflection of local reverence and superstition than verifiable paranormal activity. One of the most compelling scientific explanations for the cursed phenomenon lies in microbiology. Ancient tombs, sealed for millennia, can be breeding grounds for dangerous pathogens. Molds like Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus, along with various bacteria, can thrive in the dark, damp conditions. When a tomb is opened, these dormant spores can become airborne. Inhaling them can lead to severe respiratory infections and other illnesses, particularly in individuals with compromised immune systems. This could explain the sickness and death that sometimes befell early excavators who worked without modern protective gear. The curse might have been a biological reality, a natural defense mechanism unintentionally created by the tomb's environment. The tomb of the nobleman Idu at Giza contains a statue of him emerging from a false door, a symbolic portal between the world of the living and the dead. The statue's intense gaze and outstretched hands have been interpreted by some as a warning. The hieroglyphs in the tomb describe the duties of the funerary priests and the offerings required to sustain Idu's spirit in the afterlife. The warnings are directed at those who might neglect these duties, promising that their own funerary rites will fail. This was a common theme. The consequence for disrespecting the dead was not immediate doom, but a similar fate in the great beyond. Ultimately, the idea of the pharaoh's curse is a complex tapestry woven from ancient warnings, cultural fascination, and scientific reality. The Egyptians themselves were not casting magical spells. They were issuing clear deterrents, grounded in their profound beliefs about life, death, and the eternal journey of the soul. The stories that followed are a testament to our own enduring fascination with their world. A world where the line between the sacred and the profane was guarded with solemn pronouncements carved in stone. The true legacy is not one of supernatural vengeance, but of a civilization's profound effort to ensure eternity. Thank you for watching.